So, how does a public servant, a guy with a 30-year career and a reputation for integrity, end up suspended, stripped of his duties, and denied his entire life savings? Well, he claims it all happened for one simple reason. He followed the rule book. This is a story about what happens when doing things by the book clashes with power.
And that's the question from the man himself, Radhashyam Mahapatro. It's a question that really gets to the heart of this whole personal and professional crisis, a crisis that was born from one single pivotal moment.
To really understand the shock of his downfall, you first have to understand the kind of career he built. We're not talking about a rookie here. This was a seasoned director, right at the top of his game. For 3 whole decades, Mahapatro built this reputation as a principled, by-the-book leader across India's public sector undertakings, the PSUs. His work at Central Coalfields was all about major reforms, and by 2020, he lands one of the top HR jobs in the country as a director at NALCO. And then 2023 happened.
And get this. This wasn't just a friendly character reference. This was an official assessment from a top ministry official, and it was written 2 years before this whole incident blew up. It really cements Mahapatro's strong reputation, but it also gives you a little hint, right? A hint of some pre-existing tension with his boss, the chairman and managing director, or CMD.
So that tension eventually boiled over, leading to the one single event that changed everything. And it all started in what should have been a completely standard, totally routine meeting.
The whole thing centered around something called a Departmental Promotion Committee, or a DPC. Now, this is the official group that decides who moves up the ladder, and it's supposed to be this objective process that's governed by very specific rules to make sure everything is fair.
And here it is, the flashpoint, May 2023, a DPC meeting for some mid-level executives. The problem? The committee just could not agree on one candidate for the finance department. A simple disagreement that, instead of being handled by the book, just ignited a total firestorm.
And this brings us right to the core of the conflict. Because if you look at the inquiry documents, this wasn't just a personality clash. No, this was a fundamental battle over which rules to follow: the official government guidelines or the company's internal way of doing things.
Okay, so here's the first big disagreement. Mahapatro argued that the Ministry of Mines directives were crystal clear. Every member has to fill out their own individual assessment sheet to score the candidates. But the CMD, he insisted on NALCO's internal practice of just passing around a single, common assessment sheet for everybody to sign.
The second conflict was all about what to do when the committee couldn't agree. Mahapatra stood his ground, saying the rulebook calls for a clear, quantitative solution. You average the scores from the individual sheets. The CMD, though, he brought in this new idea that wasn't in the rules at all, that a majority decision was good enough, something the board only officially talked about after this whole mess had already exploded.
This table from the inquiry really just lays it all out. On the assessment method, Mahapatro's pointing to ministry guidelines for individual marking, while the CMD is pointing to NALCO's internal practice. On the CMD's role, Mahapatro says he can't give marks because he wasn't even at the interviews. The CMD says his physical presence was irrelevant. And for resolving disagreements, Mahapatro says average the scores. The CMD says a majority is enough. But look at the last row, the source of authority. It says it all. Mahapatro is citing NALCO's own rulebook and ministry directives. The CMD, he's citing normal principles of law and a board opinion that they got after the fact.
So we've seen the procedural fight. Now let's talk about the consequences. For his insistence on following the rules as he saw them, Radhashyam Mahapatra paid an absolutely staggering price.
First up, a 6-month suspension. For a procedural disagreement with no actual misconduct proven, this was an incredibly long and harsh punishment.
And then, for over 9 months, his career was just put on ice. I mean, even after they lifted his suspension, he wasn't put back in his old role. He was transferred and basically sidelined, with no real duties, all the way until the day he retired.
And this is maybe the most shocking part. 0. A big, fat 0. More than a year after he retired, after 30 decades of service, he has not received a single rupee of his pension, his provident fund, or any of his other benefits.
I mean, the contrast is just wow. When you compare the two men, it's stark. For Radhashyam Mahapatro, suspension, being sidelined, and 0 retirement benefits. For the CMD's Shri Radhashyam, a big ceremonial farewell, full honors, and all his benefits paid right on time. One dispute, 2 completely different endings.
So this brings us to today. The official proceedings are over, but for Mahapatro, there's no closure at all. It just leaves these massive,
unresolved questions about fairness and accountability. What's really at stake here is his entire financial security after a lifetime of work. His pension, his provident fund, his leave encashment, all of it is just frozen, trapped in some kind of procedural limbo.
And really, it all boils down to this. The official charge against him was tampering with records, but Mahapatro's defense has been the same from day one. He wasn't changing anyone else's marks. He was simply filling out his own score sheet. An act he says wasn't just his right, it was his duty.
And that leaves us with his final, really troubling question. The documents show a clear conflict between an officer who is citing the rulebook and a leader who is citing practice and authority. So, when a system's own written rules clash with the will of its leadership, who is supposed to protect the person who just follows the rules?